This is TWiT.
So the cruise I was just on and missed the show, although there's a couple of fans of the show on there said, "Are you going to do the show from the boat?" And I'm like,
nice.
No, I'm not.
That's awesome.
And maybe I could have, maybe not. I don't know. So it was if it's a cruise ship, like everything's questionable there.
Yeah, but I've done shows from a cruise ship. It's not fun.
Yeah, it's
hard work.
There was about 20 of us that all went for our friend's 50th birthday.
Oh, nice.
And one of the activities was a whiskey tasting. So everybody was on me to go to the whiskey tasting. I'm like, listen, I'm not going to a whiskey tasting.
I've tasted whiskey. I know whiskey.
They're like, no, you have to go. You have to go. It's like, you people just want me to torment the whiskey guy that's there. And they're like,
yeah, you would be, wouldn't you? Because this is just some guy who got nominated to do this, right? He's not,
So
it's a brown color. I think it's alcoholic.
He had a very good script. It was just wrong.
Oh no!
Anyway,
you went.
I got bullied into it, and the whiskeys they were tasting was the Macallan Color Collection, the 12, the 15, and the 18.
Well, that's not bad.
Yeah, I mean, funny, we just did a Macallan 18 just a few weeks ago because I'd gotten one as a thank you present from a conference that I'd helped to MC, and so I'm kind of sad to go back to Macallan so quickly, but I thought it was an interesting story, and I've ended up writing to the fellow my notes on this particular collection of whiskeys.
Not in front of the rest of the people.
No, I may have said a few things while we were in front of them, but that's fine. What are you going to do? And then I ended up in a huddle with a bunch of the other tasters, not just my friends, asking questions about whiskeys.
Oh, you became the expert. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, you are the expert.
Yeah, I put the time in. So we've talked about Macallan. I mean, right off the bat, it's like, why, when Alexander Reed sets it up in 1824, and that's the number they always use. Why 1824? Because the excise tax goes in 1823. And it becomes illegal to make whiskey if you don't have a license. So he got the license in 1824. The reality, of course, he leased the land in 1819, and it was always barley farms. In fact, through archaeology on the site, there's been barley grown in that place for 3 or 4 millennia. So they've been making whiskey for a long time. In fact, and of course, he didn't call it the Macallan Distillery. He called it the Eichels Distillery after Easter Eichels House, which goes back to the 1500s. So more or less, you're talking about this area been growing barley. And when you have excess barley, you make it into booze, and you have for ages.
What else are you going to do with it?
Yeah, of course. But it becomes Macallan when Roderick Kemp takes it over in 1892. And he actually renames it to Macallan Glenlivet. The name Glenlivet doesn't get dropped off until the 1980s. And it's Roderick Kemp, who had previously run Talisker, and Talisker he'd gotten into the sherry casking thing. And that's what Macallan is known for, is sherry casking, right? That's the big deal. So I thought we'd better revisit sherry, because what they're doing here in the color collection is a little bit different. And we've talked about this in various parts before, but I want to get into some brass tacks about what it really means to be a sherry cast whiskey. So sherry is a wine made in Spain, a particular set of regions. They call it the Triangle. There's really 2 kinds. There's dry sherry and there's sort of sweet sherry. The dry sherry is considered the high-end stuff made with the Palomino grape. It was originally fermented in barrels going back hundreds of years. Today, it's mostly large facilities that are making them, so it's all in stainless steel tanks. It's considered dry sherry because they fully ferment it. That is to say, they consume all of the sugar from the grape. In the sweeter versions, and there's generally 2 species, the Moscatel and the Pedro Jimenez, they stop fermentation to leave sugar in the wine by adding fortification to it, which kills the bacteria. And so you get a sweeter product. And why fortification? Well, one is to knock out the yeast, but the other is to knock out bacteria in general. Ports and sherries were invented largely as fortified wine because otherwise the wine would spoil. By raising the alcohol level to about 15 to 18%, you keep the bacteria out so it can be stored for longer. I mean, before the era of refrigeration and so forth, this is how you kept your alcohol from going bad. Typically wine. Now, sherry gets a little weird, right? Because sherry, they actually discovered that there is different ways to age sherry. If you just age it in barrels, it tends to lose color as it ages. It gets paler and paler, and that's what they call the Oloroso aging. But if you age it, if you allow a bacterial film to grow over top of the sherry, they call floor, it'll actually anaerobically age. And so it'll keep its color while still getting that smooth flavor. And so the Fino style of sherry uses floor, where the Oloroso, it doesn't. And so if they know they're going to make Oloroso, they'll raise the alcohol level to the point where it kills all bacteria, around 18%. And it will lose color over time. Where the Finos, they only raise it to about 15%, which is strong enough to kill a lot of the bad bacteria, but not so much to kill the floor, and the floor is maintained. And where this floor hangs out is in the Solera. So the process of making sherry, and we've talked about this before, is this bodega style barreling where they have 3 layers of these large 600-liter barrels. Now, in the very early days, it was European oak. But as soon as American oak was available in the early 1800s, as the United States began to form and started trading with Europe, of course, they were using barrels for storing everything, right? That was the way barrels were done. And it wouldn't take very long before folks found out that the species of oak, what we know as American oak today, tasted better than European oak. And so long before the whiskey industry used American oak barrels, the sherry industry used American oak. They paint their barrels matte black so they can see if they're leaking because they keep them for decades. And this 3-layer stacking, the bottom layer is the most mature. It's been around the longest. And then there's a second layer and a top layer. And again, we've talked about this before. When they're going to go do a bottling, they only take about half of the sherry out of each bottom cask to go into bottling. And then the middle tier gets partially drained down to the lower tier, and then the upper tier gets partially drained in the middle tier, and then the top tier gets the new make added.
This is a sherry aging barn we visited in Spain in Cadiz. Yeah. And this was what they made Oloroso. It was incredible.
And you can see how big those barrels are, right? They're instead of the typically 250 liter that we see with bourbon and with whiskey, you're seeing 500 and 600 liter barrels. They're very large. They're heavy. Yeah. But also, sherry is not supposed to taste oaky.
Right.
And so they don't look, the alcohol level is low enough that you're not having the same solvent effects. You're not pulling the phenols out of the wood the same way you would with a grain spirit. And they also keep the wood for really long. Most sherry makers will tell you 20-year-old barrels are still too young. That barrels don't get really good in the Solera until they're 50 years old.
Look how ancient these barrels look.
Yeah.
They look Middle Ages.
Yeah. They want 50-plus-year-old barrels in there.
These were,
Which brings us back to this whole conversation about sherry aging whiskey, because the sherry guys are not letting their old barrels go. That's just not a thing. Oh, they never have.
Good point.
So what is sherry aging actually about? It's about shipping the barrels. So these bodega casks were never made available to whiskey makers, ever. But back in the day, in the 1800s, the way you shipped sherry was in transport casks, also 500 liters, also American oak, but they were new make barrels, and you only put it in there to ship them. And typically they were only in there for 6 months to maybe 2 years. The amount of time they get made up in batches. So they sit for a while, then they get loaded on ships and they travel for a while. Then they get unloaded into warehouse and they sit for a while. Then they go out to distributors where they sit for a while. And typically you would send your servant down to the whiskey or the sherry purveyor with your decanter to fill a few bottles because glass was so valuable back in those days. And so everything was moved around by barrel. And if you were a big enough place, maybe you bought a whole barrel yourself, and who knows how long it would take to use it. So it would age to some degree in those barrels, in these storage barrels. But once the barrel was empty, what do you do with it? And so the first records we have of the Scots using ex-transport casks is like 1814. So this has been going on a really long time. And these transport casks were being used to age whiskey because what else to do with the barrels? They would just use them, and people like the flavor, right? However, whiskey gets way more popular than sherry, and bottles start becoming less expensive once you get to the industrial age in the early 1900s when we have 5 and 7 year olds helping them make glass bottles. And so those barrels start to get harder and harder to come by. These just don't use transport casks. And by 1986, the Spanish simply said, you cannot ship in barrels anymore. You must ship in bottles. But long before that, you already had the crisis. By the end of the 1800s, you're already in trouble with, it's just not enough sherry casks to grow around. And so people innovate. In the 1920s, a guy named William Lowry, who figured out that he could take a bare wooden cask, typically American oak, but didn't have to be. And he'd put about maybe, it's a 250 or 300 liter barrel. He put about 30 liters of sherry into it. And then he'd use steam to pressurize it over a few weeks, and it would force the sherry into the wood. And that got pretty much the same effect. And so for many years, that's how they did it. And then they went even a step further. There was a very thick wine syrup used in the sherry business called Paxarette. And so when they started buying that stuff, and you'd literally put a scoop of this into the barrel before you prep the barrel, and it would give you the sherry flavor as well. Although that got banned in the 1990s because it was a bit more of just a treatment or a flavorant rather than actually coming from the barrel. So since the 1970s, this is largely what they've been doing, and now it's the only way since the 80s when they basically made it impossible to do it any other way. Seasoning sherry casks is what's going on. So the whiskey maker specifies the barrel, the type of wood, the size, how much the inside of the barrel is toasted, all of the specifications. The sherry maker makes that barrel on their behalf and then fills it with sherry wine, probably not fortified at all, and lets it sit for 6 months up to maybe 30 months. It obviously costs more the longer you let it sit. And in fact, if you only let it sit for 6 months, they'll likely take that liquid out of the barrel and put it into another barrel. They'll do it several times. But this liquid does not become fine sherry. It typically only becomes sherry vinegar. So the quality of the sherry is nowhere near the same. But this has been the reality for 50 years. This is what they call sherry seasoned casks. So virtually every sherry cask whiskey I've ever tasted comes from this era of how they actually made these barrels. That they were never, it was never the fictional story of fine sherry barrels being taken from the sherry distillery and used for whiskey. It was always just a transport cask. It was only a year or two ever. And now it's even more specialized in exactly that way. And the barrel may be reused several times. So it's just a flavor. I'm liking back to what the Canadians were doing with their 1/11th rule, where they just put sherry in the bottle, under like 4 or 5% and call it, that's still whiskey, close enough. Because that's what you're doing anyway. It is interesting to think in terms that all of these casks were American oak, because the utilization of American oak from bourbon casks doesn't come till after World War II. Right? That's as the American industry explodes post-World War II with the Bretton Woods and the whole export model, that's when you start seeing these ex-bourbon casks appearing in whiskey production. But long before that, sherry casks were made with American oak and had those flavors, and that's one of the things that people like. Now, Macallan has been a very successful brand. In many ways, I think I said this when we were talking about the original 18 sherry cask. This is the first expensive whiskey you typically buy because they've done such a good job of maintaining this sense of brand and quality and so forth. But it also created some tremendous problem for them too, because they sold far more whiskey than they could possibly produce. And so where they originally, going back to Roderick Kemp in 1892, like for 100 years, they just made sherry cask whiskey. But as the sherry cask got harder and harder to get, and they needed more and more, it's a real problem when you're selling a lot of Macallan 12 that you didn't lay up enough 12 years ago. I don't think you can rush this that fast, right? Like you can't catch up. And so in the early 2000s, Macallan started experimenting with ways to try and age more quickly and to make other versions. And so the Fine Oak series that got introduced, which is in 2004, was actually aging in bourbon casks. They're far less expensive. They're far more plentiful. And they would do a year of finishing in these sherry casks. The real crisis came in 2012. In 2012, they produced a line they called the Color Series. They actually called it the 1824 Collection, but everybody else referred to it as a Color Series because they had no age statements on them. They were just colors based on the color of the liquid.
I know that these are marked travel versions.
Yes, because they're all for duty free. But
you've told us never to buy anything at the duty free store.
And I'm going to tell you it again. And I'll tell you why in just a second.
Okay.
But before this color series, this earlier one that they called the 1824 collection, they didn't have age statements on it. They were just called Gold, Amber, Sienna, and Ruby. And they were, this is in 2012, $57, $71, $103, and $184. They were not that popular because the other thing that the industry has done is convinced you that age matters. Right? That they've pitched this idea so hard about aging whiskey that a 12-year-old is better than a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old is better than a 12-year-old, which may or may not be true. You know, these are marketing tactics. And so Macallan, in their effort when they just couldn't actually use the age declarations because there's rules around them, tried these no age statements ones, and they didn't go particularly well.
Well, this one's browner.
Well, and just talking about aging in general, this whole idea of there has a minimum requirement for aging is only barely 100 years old.
Oh, interesting.
Scots got to this first. The original act was called the Immature Spirits Restriction Act of 1950. And it said that whiskey had to be aged at least 2 years. In 1916, they raised it to 3 years. Now, why did they do that? Well, think of the name, Immature Spirits Restriction Act. What they were actually fighting was cheap Irish whiskey, the whiskey with an E. Because remember the coffee still? The coffee still invented in 1870 in Ireland, and it made making alcohol really inexpensive and fast.
And immature.
And as there's more and more cheap alcohol, you have more and more public drunkenness and so forth. And now that stuff gets associated with poverty and low-class behavior and so forth. And so the Scottish, to differentiate themselves from the Irish, they drop the E out of the name whiskey, and they go in with these rules about you got to age it, you got to follow all these rules. Those rules will get advanced even further into the Scottish Whisky Act as UK law in 1933, which is to get the barley rules and the distillation rules and so on. And then there's been continued updates. There were more updates in the 80s. The current version, which they call the Scottish Whisky Regulations, are from 2009, big on EU VQA compliance so that they can protect it internationally. But the actual we now know that age statements are required to be the youngest thing in the bottle. So if you see a Macallan 12, the youngest thing in that bottle is at least 12 years old. There might be something older in it because they got to try to get to a flavor profile, but it's 12. That was only a legal requirement in Scotland in 1989. They've been putting age statements on whiskey for a really long time. And in the 1930s, 1940s, you wouldn't usually have a year on it. It would say old or well matured. And typically they were like in the 5 to 10 year range. It didn't really get to the really old stuff till later. But I just want to remind you that all of this is marketing. It's 100% marketing. Sure, we put rules around it after the fact, but it was what will make you pay more for a bottle of whiskey. And believe me, it's worked for Macallan. Macallan is one of the largest distillery complexes in the world. They rebuilt their entire distillery. Actually, they built it beside. The old distillery is still there, shut down. They're talking about starting it back up again. But they make 15 million liters a year in the new facility, which they took them 4 years to build it. 2014 and 2018, they built this huge new facility, 36 stills. Like, it is a beast.
It has a great reputation, though, right?
It does. Their reputation's impeccable.
And I noticed these color collections are dated. They do have years on them.
Yes, because they've only made them for a couple of years. This particular series only started in 2023. So let me talk about 3 different lines of whiskey, and we'll finish with the color collection. So the classic, which we call the sherry casks. There's lots of different years, but let's just compare the 12, the 15, and the 18. Yeah. And I did the 18 a few weeks ago. It was a $400 bottle of whiskey. The 15 is about $155 to 12-year-olds about $85. Now, those are the straight sherry cask editions. They also made the Fine Oak series, but those are now gone. The current version of the mixed barrelings, where they do both bourbon and sherry, are currently called the double casks. And there's a 12, a 15, and 18 that are $72, $175, and $350 respectively. Slightly cheaper than the sherry cask, but only slightly. In fact, the 15 is more expensive. And I'll tell you why. Because it tastes the best. And so they've actually upped the price on that. So the color collection. So what's distinctive about the Color Collection? Well, as it says, it is aged in sherry seasoned casks. That's all it's aged in. Now, the barrels they've actually used, we've dug in a little deeper, found that it's about 90% American oak, 10% European oak. So they're using a combination of casking. So both of them have been soaked in sherry for a certain amount of time. How long, we do not know. But the prices at select duty frees, the 12-year-old is $92, the 15-year-old is $186, and the 18-year-old is $390. They cost as much, if not more, than the traditional sherry casks version. Now, I tasted all three. The 15 tasted the best by far, and none of them are bad, but none of them are great either. And for the money, just buy the sherry cask. Like, why? You can save a little bit by going to the double cask, and arguably it's a better made product. But in general, it just reminds me once again, buying these whiskeys at a duty-free is a mistake. They're designed for people who forgot to get someone a gift. So
that's why the bottles are so pretty.
Yeah. You know what? If you forgot to get someone a gift, in the taxi on the way over, stop at a Total Wine or a Bevmo and buy a real bottle. Don't buy at the duty-free. You're wasting money.
Somebody wants to know how much you spend on whiskey.
Well, I get given a lot of whiskey.
Yeah, you don't have to spend anymore.
Yeah, but admittedly, I do. I spend some. And most of the time when I'm buying a bottle of whiskey, it's $100, right? It's a 12.
Yeah.
I don't really try and buy old whiskeys.
So it's the 30-year-old Macallan from the Color Collection. I mean, it's a 30-year-old whiskey, right?
$4,000? Yes.
$4,000.
Which begs the question, how, when they've only been making the color edition for 2 years?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what I wonder is this not them going through a set of barrels that wouldn't make it in the sherry cask edition, wasn't good enough, and saying, let's make something else. You know what? We'll sell in the duty free. That's what we'll do.
That's hysterical.
I'm not going to make fun of Macallan. They've done an unbelievable job. Their product is good. You know, just don't buy into this branding. Taste it. Taste it blind if you can, and see what you like and enjoy that. And don't, and try and resist the 18. It's just too much money.
Yeah. Of course, that's why they sell it on a cruise ship, right? That's the whole point of that.
And that whole place is a big floating duty free, right?
Yeah.
That's what it is.
It's just a floating. That's what it is. It's a whole duty free boat. The whole boat's duty free.
Yeah, boats.
It's a tax
avoidance in Norwalk. That's what a cruise ship is.
I remember one of the first cruises. It might have been the first cruise I ever went on in 1981. We went to St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, and everybody gets on the boat with a giant box of booze.
Yep.
You go into town. The whole downtown is structured to have you buy booze and jewelry. Mm-hmm. And then you get back on the boat with your...
It's like Sonoma.
And they say, are you going shopping today? This is the day. We're in St. Thomas. I don't know if it's still that way, but... Yeah, Sonoma, there's good stuff to buy in Sonoma. Sure.